The Allegheny National Forest doesn't just grow, it devours, its canopy a suffocating shroud of hemlock and pine that turns the midday sun into a series of jagged, blinding needles. I've worn the Stetson and the badge of a state trooper for 12 years, and I've learned that the woods don't have a memory, they have an appetite. My boots crunched over the dry mast of the forest floor, a sound like breaking teeth, as I navigated the treacherous lip of the Rimrock Overlook. The calls for Edward had stopped an hour ago. We had moved past the stage of hopeful shouting and into the heavy, leaden silence of a recovery operation. 10 years old. Edward was 10, wearing a bright blue windbreaker and a pair of brand new red sneakers. In a forest this deep, those colors should have screamed against the oppressive greens and browns. But the Allegheny has a way of muting the world, of pulling the light into its gullet and leaving you with nothing but the smell of damp earth and the feeling of unseen eyes tracking your jugular. The sun was high, a cruel, white disk that offered no warmth, only a harsh glare that turned the shadows in the rock formations into bottomless pits of obsidian. I reached a plateau of massive quartz conglomerate, the ancient stones cracked and weathered into a labyrinth of narrow fissures. That's when I saw them. The red sneakers. They weren't scattered. They weren't lost in a struggle. They were placed with a terrifying, surgical precision on a flat shelf of stone right at the mouth of a vertical crevice. The laces were tucked inside, the heels aligned perfectly with the edge. They looked like an offering. Seeing them there, so neat and domestic against the primordial rod of the woods, sent a spike of pure, crystalline dread through my chest. It wasn't the sight of a child lost, it was the sight of a child invited. I knelt, the heat of the stone radiating through my trousers, but as I leaned closer to the crevice, the temperature plummeted. A draft surged up from the throat of the earth, a subterranean exhale that carried the suffocating stench of wet iron and stagnant, prehistoric water. It smelled like a meat locker left to fester in a basement. I clicked my radio, the plastic casing slick with sudden sweat. The device hissed, a violent eruption of static that sounded like 1,000 dead voices trying to scream through a mouthful of silt. No signal. Just that rhythmic, pulsating white noise that seemed to sync up with the frantic thudding of my own heart. I called Edward's name into the hole. My voice didn't echo. The darkness down there was thick, viscous, swallowing the sound before it could even bounce off the walls. I checked my gear, the heavy weight of my service weapon a cold comfort against my hip, and began to squeeze into the fissure. The rock was slick with a translucent, oily film that felt like necrotic sweat. As my eyes adjusted to the transition from the blinding daylight to the deep, oppressive shadows, I realized this wasn't just a natural fault in the stone. There were notches. Small, shallow indentations hand-carved into the rock, forming a crude, narrow staircase that spiraled down into the guts of the mountain. They were too small for a man's feet, designed for something with a shorter stride, or perhaps something that didn't mind the cramped, crushing weight of the earth. Descending was like crawling down the throat of a giant. The light from above became a taunting, distant sliver of white, while the darkness below grew heavy, pressing against my eardrums until they throbbed. The further I went, the more the world of the living ceased to exist. My radio was a dead weight now, emitting nothing but a low, wet gurgle of static. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating walls that were etched with strange, swirling patterns that looked less like art and more like the frantic scratchings of something trying to claw its way out. And then, the stairs ended. I stepped out into a small, vaulted chamber where the air was so cold my breath came out in ragged, ghostly plumes. The floor was covered in a layer of fine, black silt. In the center of the room, sitting cross-legged with his back to me, was Edward. He was perfectly still, his small frame hunched over something I couldn't see. "Edward," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the void. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn. I moved around him, my boots making no sound in the heavy dust. When I saw his face, the dread I had felt earlier turned into a cold, paralyzing terror. His skin was the color of curdled milk, and his hands, those small, innocent hands, were stained a deep, bruised black up to the wrists, as if he had been dipping them in ink. He was staring at a small, circular hole in the floor, a drain-like opening that whistled with the same rhythmic pulse I had heard on my radio. "Why did you come down here, Edward?" I asked, my hand hovering near his shoulder but trembling too much to touch him. He looked up at me then. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown out until they were just two shimmering pools of black glass. He didn't look scared. He looked hollowed out, like a house that had been vacated in a hurry. "The people under the rocks," he said, his voice a flat, melodic monotone that didn't sound like a 10-year-old boy. "They told me to come down." They told me I had to be very, very quiet. Why? I managed to choke out, the metallic smell of the air making my stomach roll. Because their river is blocked, Edward replied, turning his gaze back to the hole in the floor. They can't sleep when the water doesn't flow right. They wanted me to hold my breath so they could hear the earth move. They said if I was good, they'd let me see the city under the dam. I grabbed him then, the contact with his skin feeling like touching a slab of ice. He was unnaturally light, as if his bones had been replaced with driftwood. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I hoisted him over my shoulder and began the frantic, lung-bursting climb back toward the sliver of daylight. Every step up those hand-carved notches felt like the rock was closing in, the walls vibrating with a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. I felt things brushing against my boots in the dark, cold, damp pressures that vanished the moment I kicked out. When we finally broke the surface, the harsh natural light hit us like a physical blow. I collapsed onto the quartz plateau, gasping for air that didn't taste like rust. Edward just sat there, staring back at the crevice, his black-stained hands resting limply in his lap. I grabbed my radio, ready to shout for a medevac, ready to tell them I found him. But as I looked down at the radio, the static suddenly cleared for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a voice that came through. It was the sound of a rhythmic, heavy knocking. 9 slow, deliberate thuds, coming from somewhere deep beneath the soles of my boots. I looked at Edward, and for the first time, he smiled. It wasn't a child's smile. It was the smile of someone who had just closed a deal they didn't fully understand. I looked back at the crevice, and in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the sun, I saw the sneakers were gone. There was no wind. There was no one else on that ridge. But the flat stone where the red shoes had been neatly placed was now empty, save for a small, wet smear of that black, oily silt. The forest was silent again, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator that had just been fed, settling in to wait for its next meal. I realized then that I hadn't rescued Edward. I had just been allowed to take him back, and the price for that mercy was a debt that the Allegheny never forgets to collect. The red sneakers were the first thing that didn't belong. They sat on a shelf of grey limestone at the Rimrock Overlook, perfectly parallel, laces tucked inside the tongues as if they were waiting for a boy to step back into them. But Edward was gone, and the Allegheny National Forest doesn't usually return what it takes in such neat condition. I am a state trooper. I have seen what the brush does to a human body after 48 hours. It shreds clothes, it mats hair with burrs and mud, and it breaks the spirit. These shoes were clean. They were an insult to the chaos of a missing person case. Behind the sneakers was the crack. It was a vertical slit in the rock, no wider than a man's shoulders, exhaling a breath that made my skin crawl. It didn't smell like the forest. It didn't smell like pine needles or damp earth. It smelled like a radiator leak in a flooded basement, metallic, stagnant, and impossibly cold. I pulled my mag light from my belt, the beam cutting through the humid afternoon air, and leaned into the fissure. The light didn't hit a back wall. It just kept going, swallowed by a throat of stone that seemed to tighten the deeper it went. I called his name. Edward. My voice didn't echo. The stone swallowed the sound, dampening it instantly into a flat, dead thud. I should have waited for backup. I should have radioed in the find and stayed by those red sneakers until the search and rescue teams arrived with their ropes and their protocol. But the air coming out of that hole felt like a hand pressing against my chest, urging me in. I squeezed through. The transition was immediate. The sounds of the Allegheny, the wind in the hemlocks, the distant chatter of hikers, the drone of insects, died. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator that had just been fed, settling in to wait for its next meal. My flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering against walls that were too smooth to be natural. These weren't the erratic fractures of shifting tectonic plates. These were stairs. They were shallow, hand-carved, and slick with a translucent film that looked like snail trail but felt like engine grease. I descended. 1 step. 5. 20. My radio began to emit a low-frequency hum, a sound like a swarm of bees trapped in a glass jar. I clicked it off, but the hum remained, vibrating in my teeth. The air grew heavier, pressing against my eardrums until they popped. I reached a landing where the stairs ended and the tunnel opened into a small, circular chamber. My light landed on him. Edward was sitting in the center of the room. He was 10 years old, but in the flickering glow of my mag light, he looked ancient. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shivering. He was just sitting there, cross-legged, staring at the far wall. His hands were resting on his knees, palms up. They were black. Not dirty, not bruised, but stained with a substance that looked like liquid obsidian, clinging to his skin up to his wrists. It looked as if he had dipped them into a pool of ink that refused to dry. "Edward," I whispered. My own voice sounded alien to me, a rasping intrusion in this tomb. He didn't turn his head. He just blinked, his eyes reflecting my flashlight with a dull, silver sheen that I'd only ever seen in the eyes of a deer caught in the high beams just before the impact. "They told me to stay quiet," the boy said. His voice was flat, devoid of the inflection of a child. It was the voice of someone reciting a grocery list. "Who, Edward? Who told you?" "The people under the rocks," he replied. "They wanted to sleep. Their river was blocked, and the noise from above makes their heads ache. I had to come down so they could show me how to hold the silence." I moved toward him, my boots squelching on the greasy floor. The smell of rust was overwhelming now, thick enough to taste on the back of my tongue. I reached out to grab his shoulder, expecting him to flinch or scream, but he remained limp. As I lifted him, his weight felt wrong. He was too heavy, like his bones had been replaced with lead. "We have to go," I told him, more for my own benefit than his. The climb back up was a blur of claustrophobia and mounting dread. Every time my flashlight flickered, I expected to see something standing on the stairs behind us, something with long, pale fingers and eyes that hadn't seen the sun in 1,000 years. I felt eyes on the back of my neck, a physical pressure that made my skin itch. I realized then that I hadn't rescued Edward. I had just been allowed to take him back, and the price for that mercy was a debt that the Allegheny never forgets to collect. When we broke the surface and emerged back into the humid Pennsylvania afternoon, the world felt wrong. The green of the trees was too bright, the sky too blue, like a painting that hadn't quite dried. I carried Edward past his red sneakers and back toward the trailhead. He never asked for his shoes. He just looked back at the crack in the rock, his black-stained hands clutching my uniform, leaving dark, oily smears on my chest. The fallout started before we even reached the station. By the time I had Edward in the back of an ambulance, my captain was already there. He didn't ask about the boy's health. He didn't ask how I found him. He looked at the black residue on my shirt and his face went grey, a shade of ash that matched the stones at Rimrock. "Forget the stairs," he said, his voice a low hiss near my ear. I stared at him. "Captain, there's a structure down there. Hand-carved." The kid was. "There were no stairs," he interrupted, his grip on my arm tightening until it hurt. "You found him in a shallow depression near the trail. He was dehydrated and disoriented. That's the report. That's the only report that exists." He didn't wait for my response. He walked away, barking orders at the other troopers to clear the area. When I went to the hospital the next day to check on Edward, the nurses told me he had been transferred to a private facility in Pittsburgh. No record of his admission remained in their system. When I tried to pull the GPS data from my radio, the file was corrupted. Nothing but a wall of digital static that sounded like the humming I'd heard in the cave. The system was closing a wound, skinning over a truth that wasn't meant for the light of day. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't forget the way Edward had looked at that wall, or the smell of that ancient, metallic river he'd mentioned. 2 weeks later, I went back. I didn't take my cruiser. I took my personal truck and hiked in from a side trail miles away, avoiding the main overlooks. The forest felt different now. It didn't feel like a park. It felt like a cathedral built for a god that demanded blood. I found the spot where the crack had been. It was gone. Not filled in, not covered with brush. The rock was solid. The grey limestone was a single, unbroken face of moss and lichen, as if the fissure had never existed. I ran my hands over the stone, searching for a seam, a crack, anything. There was nothing but the cold, indifferent weight of the mountain. I began to circle the area, my heart hammering against my ribs. About 50 yards from the site, tucked under a cluster of mountain laurel, I found it. A spiral. It was made of smooth, river-worn pebbles, perfectly arranged on the forest floor. A length of red twine, the kind used for heavy-duty industrial packaging, was woven through the stones, binding them together in a tight, concentric circle. It looked like a target, or a seal. I shouldn't have dug. A sane man would have walked away, resigned his commission, and moved to the desert. But I'm a state trooper. I'm paid to look at things people want hidden. I used a folding camp shovel to pry up the center stone. 6 inches down, I hit wood. It was a small, square hatch made of rot-resistant cedar, flush with the earth. There was no lock, just a simple iron ring, pitted with rust. When I pulled it open, the smell hit me again, the metallic, stagnant breath of the deep earth. I lowered my light into the hole. It wasn't a tunnel this time. It was a cache. A small, stone-lined chamber sat beneath the hatch. Inside were dozens of small bundles, each one wrapped in white cloth and tied tightly with the same red twine I'd seen in the spiral. They were arranged in neat rows, like offerings on an altar. I reached in and pulled one out. The cloth was stained with the same black, oily substance that had been on Edward's hands. I untied the twine. Inside was a gold pocket watch. I opened the casing. Inscribed on the interior was a name, Tony Owens. I felt the blood drain from my face. Tony Owens had gone missing in the Allegheny in 1994. He was 7 years old. The case had gone cold decades ago, a ghost story used to frighten rookies. I grabbed another bundle, a set of car keys. Another, a silver locket with a picture of a smiling woman. Another, a set of brass dog tags. These were the trophies of the disappeared. This was a ledger of the forest's debts, kept in the dark where no one would ever look. At the very bottom of the pile, I found something different. It wasn't wrapped in cloth. It was a heavy, rectangular piece of copper, oxidized to a dull green. Stamped into the metal were 3 words, Kinzua Dam 1965. I tucked the copper tag into my pocket and grabbed the locket. I needed proof. I needed someone else to see this, someone I could trust. I thought of Lena. She was a detective out of the Warren barracks, sharp, skeptical, and one of the few people who didn't look at me like I was losing my mind when I talked about the Rimrock case. I called her from the trailhead. I told her I found something. I told her to meet me at the Overlook at dusk. When Lena arrived, the sun was a dying ember behind the hills, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. She looked tired, her eyes scanning the tree line with a professional wariness. "This better be worth the drive," she said, leaning against her Jeep. "The captain is already asking why you're spending so much time out here on your off days." I didn't speak. I just led her into the woods, following my own bent branches and scuffed dirt back to the mountain laurel. My pulse was a frantic rhythm in my throat. I wanted her to see it. I needed her to tell me I wasn't crazy. "Here," I said, pointing to the ground. Lena looked down. She frowned. "Hear what?" "The spiral. The hatch. I was just here 3 hours ago." I dropped to my knees, frantically brushing away the leaf litter. My fingers hit stone. Not a hatch. Not wood. Solid, ancient rock. The spiral was gone. The red twine was gone. The earth was packed tight, covered in a layer of old pine needles that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in a century. I started digging with my bare hands, my nails clawing at the dirt until they bled. "There's a chamber," I shouted, my voice cracking. There were bundles. Tony Owens' watch. A copper tag. Lena knelt beside me, her hand resting on my shoulder. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was the grip of someone preparing to make a hard decision. "There's nothing here," she said softly. "Just dirt and stone." I pulled the copper tag from my pocket. "Look." I held it out to her, the metal cold and heavy in my palm. Lena looked at my hand. Then she looked at me. Her expression shifted from concern to something colder. Something like pity. "You're holding a handful of wet bark," she said. I looked down. My palm was empty of metal. Instead, I was clutching a jagged piece of rotting hemlock bark, dripping with a black, foul-smelling slime. I dropped it, the wood hitting the ground with a wet thud. The black stain remained on my skin, seeping into the pores of my hand, cold as the grave. The forest hadn't just hidden the cache. It had rewritten the reality of what I was holding. It was gaslighting me, pushing me toward the edge of the same void that had swallowed Edward. Lena stood up, wiping her hands on her trousers. "You need to take some leave. I'll tell the captain you're overworked. But if you come back here, I can't help you." She turned and walked back toward the trail, her silhouette disappearing into the deepening gloom. I stayed there on my knees, staring at the solid rock beneath me. The silence returned, but this time, it was different. It was expectant. From deep beneath the ground, far below the layers of limestone and the roots of the ancient trees, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. Tapping. 1, 2, 3. A pause. 4. 5. 6. 7. 8. 9. It was coming from the pipes, from the veins of the mountain. I pressed my ear to the stone, and for a fleeting second, I didn't hear the earth. I heard a river, but it wasn't water. It was the sound of thousands of small, hard objects, teeth, stones, coins, tumbling through a dark, pressurized space. The river was blocked, and the tenders were looking for someone to clear the way. I went home that night, but I didn't sleep. I sat in my darkened kitchen, watching the sink. At 3 a.m., the tapping started in the drain. Slow, rhythmic, counting to 9. I realized then what the red twine was for. It wasn't just to tie the bundles. It was a leash, and the other end was already wrapped around my throat. The next day, I didn't go to work. I went to see Isaac. Isaac was a retired trooper who lived in a cabin on the edge of the forest, a man who had spent 40 years patrolling the Allegheny and another 10 trying to drown the memories in cheap bourbon. People said he'd lost his mind after his partner disappeared in the 60s. They said he saw things in the trees. He didn't act surprised when I showed up on his porch, my hands still stained with the black ink that wouldn't wash off. He just looked at my wrist and nodded toward the door. "You found the trophy room," he said, his voice like grinding gravel. "I found something." Then it vanished. "It didn't vanish," Isaac replied, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid. "It just moved." The forest is a nervous system. The tunnels, the caves, the old mines, they're the nerves. Sometimes they fire, sometimes they go dormant. When we built the Kinzua Dam, we didn't just flood the valley. We drowned their highways. Who are they? Isaac stared into his glass. The tenders. They've been here since the ice retreated. They keep the balance. They mark the new paths with the red cord and they collect the toll. Every few years, the river gets clogged. The noise from the world above, the cars, the hikers, the construction, it bleeds down. It hurts them. So they take a voice. They take someone to hold the silence for them. Like Edward. Isaac nodded. But the boy was just a messenger. He was too young to be a tender. They need someone who understands the law. Someone who knows how to keep a secret. I looked at my hand. The black stains seemed to be spreading, creeping up toward my elbow. What happens if I don't go back? The forest doesn't like unfinished business, Isaac said, his eyes turning to the window. If you don't become the tender, they'll find someone else. And they'll start with the ones you brought into the circle. Lena. I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. I won't let them touch her. Isaac gave me a look of profound sadness. It's not a choice. It's a transition. You already picked up the red string. You already looked in the box. You're part of the ledger now. I drove back to the forest, the copper tag, or the bark, or whatever it was, heavy in my mind. I didn't go to Rimrock. I went to the Kinzua Dam. The massive concrete wall stood like a tombstone against the dark water of the reservoir. I found Lena's Jeep in the parking lot near the spillway. The engine was still warm, but the car was empty. Her radio was sitting on the driver's seat, emitting that same low-frequency hum I'd heard in the cave. I followed the trail down toward the base of the dam, where the water thunders out of the discharge pipes. The air was a mist of cold spray and the smell of ancient rot. I found her near the maintenance tunnel. She was standing perfectly still, her back to me. Lena. She didn't turn. Her shoulders were hunched, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Lena, we have to go. Now. She turned then, and my heart stopped. Her eyes weren't wide anymore. They were 2 pits of black, wet stone, identical to the boy's eyes in the cave. When she opened her mouth to speak, 2 voices came out. One was Lena's, a distorted, bubbling scream. The other was something else, a sound like tectonic plates grinding together. The river is choked, the voice boomed, vibrating in the marrow of my bones. The old tender has crumbled to dust. The silence must be maintained. Lena's body jerked like a marionette on a string. She began to vomit, a thick, black slurry that smelled of rust and stagnant water. It spilled over her chin, staining her uniform, the same obsidian ink that had claimed Edward. Let her go. I screamed, drawing my service weapon. I didn't know what I was going to shoot, but the weight of the gun was the only thing keeping me grounded. The entity in Lena's throat laughed, a dry, rattling sound. A debt is owed. A mark is made. Will you take the cord? I looked at Lena. Her skin was turning grey, her veins standing out like black lightning under her flesh. She was dying. The forest was hollowating her, using her as a conduit for its ancient, suffocating hunger. I dropped the gun. Yes, I whispered. I'll take it. The silence that followed was absolute. The roar of the dam vanished. The wind stopped. Even the black water flowing from Lena's mouth froze in midair. I reached into my pocket. My fingers closed around something cold and metallic. I pulled it out. It was a heavy iron needle, threaded with a long, vibrant strand of red industrial twine. I knew what I had to do. The knowledge was there, etched into my brain by the humming in the radio and the tapping in the pipes. I walked to the rock wall beside the tunnel. I knelt. I pressed the needle against my right wrist. It didn't feel like a puncture. It felt like a homecoming. I wove the red twine through my skin, stitching a perfect, concentric spiral into my own flesh. With every stitch, Lena's eyes cleared. The black slurry retreated from her lips. She collapsed, gasping for air, her lungs burning as the forest's influence withdrew. I didn't stop until the spiral was complete. The red twine was now part of me, a permanent mark of my service. The black stain on my hand didn't disappear. It settled, sinking deep into the bone. Lena looked up at me, her face pale and etched with a terror she would never be able to name. She tried to speak, but only a dry sob escaped her throat. Go, I told her. My voice was different now. It was heavier. It sounded like the earth shifting. Don't come back here. Tell them I went over the side. Tell them I'm gone. She didn't argue. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her footsteps echoing against the concrete until they were swallowed by the trees. She would quit the force. She would move away. But she would never forget the smell of the rust. I stood alone at the base of the dam. The weight of the forest settled onto my shoulders, a comfortable, crushing burden. I could feel them now, the tenders. They were moving through the stone beneath my feet, their ancient heads no longer aching. The river was flowing again. I went home one last time to gather what I needed. As I walked into my kitchen, the tapping started in the sink. 1, 2, 3. I didn't flinch. I reached out and tapped back on the cold porcelain. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The agreement was sealed. I am a state trooper in the Allegheny National Forest. I am the tender of the silence. And if you're ever hiking near Rimrock and you find a pair of clean red sneakers or a spiral of stones tied with red twine, don't look for the stairs. Because I'm the one who carved them. And I'm still down there, waiting for the river to clog again. The fluorescent lights in the cane barracks don't just illuminate, they scream. It's a low, teeth-grinding hum, a 60-cycle hum that vibrates in the marrow of your bones until you start to wonder if the electricity itself is rotting. I sat at my desk, the plastic chair sticking to my uniform, staring at a cursor that blinked like a dying pulse. I had been back from Rimrock for 6 hours. My boots were still caked with the grey, silty mud from the fissure, the dust of crushed bones and ancient shale. Edward was safe. He was with his parents, or so the radio chatter suggested. But the report I had spent 2 hours meticulously typing, detailing the hand-carved stairs, the metallic stench of the air below the rock, and the boy's chilling words about the people under the stones, was gone. I didn't mean it was unsaved. I mean it was erased. I hit the refresh key, my finger trembling. The screen flickered, a jagged spike of static dancing across the monitor. The file directory for case 88 Delta 14 was a hollow void. In its place sat a generic activity log entry, written in the flat, dead prose of a bureaucratic machine. It stated that Edward had been found wandering near the North Country Trail, dehydrated but unharmed. No mention of the sneakers. No mention of the fissure. No mention of the stairs that shouldn't exist in a geological formation that had been dormant for 10,000 years. The air in the office felt thick, like I was breathing in wet wool. I looked around. The night shift was a skeleton crew. Sergeant Miller was in his glass-walled office, the silhouette of his head motionless against the cold blue glow of his own monitor. He hadn't looked at me since I'd checked back in. He hadn't asked about the boy. He hadn't asked why my hands were stained with a black, oily residue that smelled like a junkyard after a flood. I stood up, the chair screeching against the linoleum. The sound felt like a razor blade across a chalkboard. I walked toward the records room, my heart a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. My mind kept looping back to the stairs. They weren't just carved, they were worn down by centuries of bare feet. They felt like velvet beneath my touch, a texture that suggested something more biological than mineral. I reached the terminal in the back, the one that supposedly had a direct hardline to the state archives in Harrisburg. I bypassed the standard login, using a backdoor code an old-timer had shown me years ago when we were hunting a poacher who had ties to the local council. My breath hitched. I searched for Kinzua Dam construction, 1960s, subterranean anomalies. The screen stayed black for a long beat. Then, text began to crawl across the glass, but it wasn't English. It was a jumble of corrupted ASCII characters, symbols that looked like hooks and twisted spirals. The static on the screen began to take shape, swirling into a pattern that mimicked the very fissure I had climbed into. And then, the smell hit me again. Not the stale coffee and ozone of the office, but the smell of the river. Not the fresh, running water of the Allegheny, but the stagnant, lightless water that sits in the gut of a cave. It was the smell of rusted iron and old blood. Looking for something, trooper. The voice was like a heavy weight dropped into a still pond. I spun around, my hand instinctively dropping to my holster. Sergeant Miller was standing 5 feet away. He hadn't made a sound on the tile. In the harsh, flickering light, his eyes looked like 2 holes punched in a sheet of grey paper. There was no warmth there, no camaraderie. Just a flat, corporate void. "The report, Sarge," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "It's been modified. I found a staircase at Rimrock, a physical structure." "The boy," he said. "The boy was confused," Miller interrupted. His voice was a monotonous drone, perfectly matched to the hum of the lights. "The Allegheny is full of old mining shafts, trooper. Sinkholes. Natural erosions that look like man-made structures to an exhausted mind. We don't document stairs. We don't document people under the rocks. It causes panic. It complicates the lease agreements with the logging companies. It creates friction." Friction. I stepped closer, the paranoia now a cold fire in my gut. "Miller," I touched those stairs. They weren't limestone. They felt like skin. And the air down there, it was moving. It was breathing. Miller didn't blink. He stepped into the light, and for a second, I thought I saw something moving beneath the skin of his throat, a rhythmic pulse that didn't match his heartbeat. The forest has a way of tricking the senses. You've been on the trail too long. Go home. Sleep. Forget the red sneakers. Forget the fisher. If I see another entry about this, if I hear you whispering to the dispatchers about the people below, you won't just be out of a job. You'll be a record that needs correcting. Do you understand?" The threat wasn't just professional. It was existential. He wasn't talking about firing me. He was talking about deleting me, the same way he had deleted my report. I backed away, the shadows in the corners of the room seeming to reach out toward my ankles. I left the barracks without another word. The night air of the Allegheny Forest was waiting for me outside, but it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a trap. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches interlocking to blot out the stars. I drove, but I didn't go home. My hands were gripped so tight on the steering wheel that the knuckles were white. The paranoia was no longer a theory. It was a physical presence in the passenger seat. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see Miller's cruiser, or worse, something with no headlights at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the spiral. Not a drawing of one, but the way the stones at Rimrock had been arranged. A perfect, tightening circle of red twine and river rock. It was a seal. Or a lure. I found myself pulling over near a bridge over a small tributary that fed into the reservoir. I killed the engine and the lights. The silence of the forest was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing I hadn't reported, the one thing I had palmed before the other troopers arrived at the scene, a small, weathered brass tag I'd found wedged into the top step of that impossible staircase. I turned it over in my hand. In the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy, I could make out the engravings. It wasn't a surveyor's tag. It was an identification disc, the kind they used to bolt onto heavy machinery during the dam's construction in 1965. But across the center, someone had scratched a new word into the brass with something sharp and desperate. Tender. I shivered. The word felt like a title. A duty. Suddenly, The radio in my cruiser sparked to life, even though the ignition was off. It wasn't the dispatch frequency. It was static, jagged, rhythmic static. It sounded like someone dragging a heavy chain across a stone floor. 1, 2, 3. Between the bursts of noise, a voice drifted through the speakers. It was faint, distorted, as if it were traveling through miles of pressurized water. It was Edward's voice, but it wasn't the Edward the first had pulled from the hole. This voice was hollow, resonant, layered with the echoes of 1,000 other throats. "The river is still blocked," the voice whispered. "The tenders are sleeping, and the water is turning black. Why did you bring me back to the light? The light is so thin. The light is so cold." I grabbed the handset, ready to scream, but the radio went dead. The dashboard lights flickered once and died. In the darkness, I looked at my wrist. Under the pale glow of the moon, I saw it, a faint, red line beginning to form around my skin, right where the boy had grabbed me. It looked like a thread. It looked like the twine from the spiral. I realized then that the records weren't being deleted to protect the police department or the logging companies. They were being deleted because the things below the Allegheny don't exist in our time. They are the shadows of a geography that we paved over, a world of black water and stone stairs that we tried to drown when we built the dam. And the system, the state, the law, the silent men like Miller, they aren't there to stop the horror. They are there to make sure the friction is kept to a minimum. They are the ones who make sure the sacrifices go unnoticed. I put the cruiser in gear, my eyes fixed on the dark wall of trees. I wasn't going home. I was going back to the reservoir. I needed to see the water. I needed to know if the spiral was still there, or if the forest had already started to rewrite the ground beneath my feet. As I drove, the 60-cycle hum of the office lights stayed with me, ringing in my ears, a constant reminder that once you see the stairs, you never really leave the basement. The forest isn't just a place of trees and trails. It's a skin. And beneath that skin, the tenders are waiting for the river to rise. I could feel the brass tag in my pocket growing warm, vibrating against my leg. It felt like a key, or a brand. I looked in the mirror one last time. Behind me, the road didn't stretch back to the town. It ended in a wall of grey mist. There was no Kane Barracks. There was no Sergeant Miller. There was only the sound of the water, deep and patient, calling for its next keeper. I am a state trooper in the Allegheny National Forest, but as the red line on my wrist deepened to the color of an old wound, I knew the truth. My uniform was just another layer of the cover-up. I'm not here to patrol the woods anymore. I'm here to make sure no one else finds the stairs. And if they do, I'm the one who has to make sure they never come back up to tell the story. Because the silence below the rock is the only thing keeping the river from screaming. The static came back, louder now, filling the cabin of the car. It wasn't noise anymore. It was a countdown. 7, 8, 9. I pulled the car to the edge of the overlook and stepped out into the dark. The smell of the void was everywhere now, rising from the earth like a heavy fog. I walked toward the edge, the brass tag clutched in my hand, waiting for the stairs to appear in the moonlight. I wasn't scared anymore. The paranoia had been replaced by a heavy, terminal certainty. The records were gone. The boy was changed. And I was finally reporting for duty. The forest didn't just feel empty, it felt hungry. The twilight was a fading bruise over the Allegheny, a deep, sickly purple that bled into the valleys until the shadows were thick enough to swim in. I walked toward the edge of the Rimrock Overlook, the brass tag from the Kinzua Dam clutched so tightly in my palm that the metal bit into my skin. It was a cold anchor in a world that had suddenly become untethered. The paranoia had stopped being a sharp, stinging thing. It had grown heavy, a terminal certainty that sat in my gut like a stone. I wasn't alone this time. Lena was behind me, her boots crunching on the dry needles of the forest floor. I could hear her breathing, shallow, skeptical, the sound of someone who still believed in the logic of maps and the reliability of concrete. She was my partner, my friend, and tonight, she was my only witness to the impossible. I needed her to see it. I needed to know that the static in my brain wasn't just my own mind coming apart at the seams. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rotting leaves and something metallic, like blood on a cold radiator. It was the smell of the void. We reached the clearing where the spiral of pebbles had been, the place where I had found the red rope coiled like a sleeping snake. I stopped, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, searching for the mark. There, under the roots of an ancient, twisted hemlock. The stones were still there, arranged in that perfect, nauseating spiral. It looked like an eye staring up from the dirt, a blind, stony gaze that watched the stars. "Look," I whispered, though my voice felt like it was being swallowed by the trees. "Look at the rope, Lena." I knelt down, my fingers trembling as I brushed away the mulch. The red rope was there, threaded through the stones, vibrant and wrong against the dull grey of the earth. It felt organic, like a vein pulled from a living throat. I started to dig. I didn't use a shovel. I used my bare hands, clawing at the dirt until my fingernails were packed with black grit. The hatch was still there, a slab of weathered wood and rusted iron, buried just beneath the surface like a secret the earth had tried to digest. I heaved it open, the hinges screaming with the sound of grinding bone. The air that rushed out of the hole was ice cold, smelling of wet iron and old, stagnant water, the breath of the thing under the mountain. I pointed my light down into the dark. It hit the stairs. Those hand-carved, impossible steps that descended into the throat of the forest. "You see it now?" I asked, looking back at Lena. Her face was a mask of pale horror in the flashlight spill. She didn't answer. She just stared at the hole, her hand hovering over her service weapon as if a gun could do anything against a geographical anomaly. I climbed down first. The silence was absolute. The moment my head passed below the rim of the hatch, the forest noise vanished. No wind, no crickets, just the sound of my own heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was the vault, the place where the forest kept its receipts. I reached the bottom of the stairs and panned my light around the room. It was small, a chamber carved directly into the bedrock, the walls weeping a thick, black moisture that looked like oil. And there, lined up on a shelf of jagged stone, were the bundles. They were wrapped in grey cloth, tied tight with the same red rope. Dozens of them. Scores. They were the trophies of the missing, the personal effects of people the forest had swallowed over the last 50 years. I reached for one near the edge. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. I untied the knot. The rope felt warm, almost pulsing. Inside the cloth was a gold watch. The glass was cracked, and the hands were frozen at 3:14. I turned it over. Engraved on the back in elegant, fading script were the initials T.O. Tony Owens. I breathed. He disappeared in '78. They found his car at the trailhead, but never his body. I opened another bundle. A child's silver locket. A pair of glasses with one lens missing. A wedding ring. Each one was a life condensed into a single, cold object, stored here in the dark. It was a cemetery without bodies. A museum of the forgotten. "Lena, get down here," I called out. "You have to see the names. You have to see what they've been hiding." I heard her boots on the stairs, slow and hesitant. She reached the bottom, her flashlight beam dancing erratically across the piles of cloth. She didn't speak for a long time. She just stood there, surrounded by the ghosts of the Allegheny, the sheer weight of the tragedy pressing in on us. "This is why the reports were scrubbed," I said, my voice rising with a frantic, jagged edge. "This is why the boy Edward was changed. They know about this place. The brass, the state, the people who built the dam, they know there's something under the rock that demands a tithe." Lena finally looked at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "We have to go," she whispered. "We have to get out of here right now. This isn't right. This isn't part of the job." She turned and scrambled back up the stairs, her panic infectious. I grabbed Tony Owen's watch and the brass tag, shoving them into my pocket. I couldn't leave them all behind, but the room felt like it was shrinking, the walls leaning in as if the mountain itself were taking a deep breath, preparing to crush us. I climbed out after her, my lungs burning for the fresh air of the night. I hauled myself over the lip of the hatch and stood up, gasping. The twilight was gone now. It was pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt like a physical weight against the eyes. Lena was standing a few feet away, her back to me. She was staring at the ground. "Lena," I asked, wiping the sweat and dirt from my brow. "We need to get to the cruiser. We need to call this in, even if they kill the transmission. We have the physical evidence now. They can't erase this." She didn't move. She didn't turn around. "Lena, did you hear me?" I walked toward her, my flashlight beam sweeping across the clearing. I stopped. The hatch was gone. I looked down at my feet. There was no hole, no weathered wood, no rusted iron. There was only the solid, unbroken floor of the forest, grey rock and dead needles, undisturbed by my digging. The spiral of pebbles was gone. The red rope was gone. I spun around, my light searching for the hemlock tree, for any landmark I had just used to find this place. The trees looked different. The geography had shifted, the forest floor rearranging itself like a slide puzzle while our backs were turned. "It's right here," I screamed, dropping to my knees and clawing at the ground. I was just in there. You saw it, Lena. You were standing on the stairs. I dug frantically, my fingers bleeding as I struck solid, ancient stone just inches beneath the soil. There was no void. There was no vault. There was only the cold, indifferent bedrock of the Allegheny. Lena turned around then. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable in the harsh glare of my light. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of the panic she had shown only seconds before. The hatch. The watchers. The room under the ground. I grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her. "You were in there with me. You saw Tony Owen's watch." Lena looked down at my hands, then back at my face with a pity that felt like a knife in the ribs. "We've been walking for 3 hours," she said softly. "You've been talking to yourself the whole time. You led me to this clearing and just started digging in the dirt with your bare hands, screaming about stairs that weren't there." "No," I gasped, reaching into my pocket. "I have the watch. I have the evidence." I pulled my hand out, expecting the cold weight of gold and the sharp edge of the brass tag. My palm was empty. There was nothing but a handful of wet, black silt and a few strands of rotted hemlock root. The brass tag was gone. The watch was gone. The physical reality of the vault had evaporated the moment I stepped back into the world of the living. The disorientation hit me then, a wave of vertigo so strong I felt like the earth had tilted on its axis. The trees seemed to stretch upward, their branches weaving together to form a cage against the stars. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was a presence, a thick, suffocating static that filled my ears and clouded my vision. Lena stepped back, her hand moving toward her radio. She was looking at me not as a partner, but as a threat, as a man who had finally cracked under the pressure of the woods. I didn't blame her. I could feel the sanity leaking out of me, a slow hemorrhage of logic. I looked at my hands, covered in the black dirt of a place that didn't exist, and I realized the forest hadn't just hidden the vault. It had consumed the memory of it. It had reached into the timeline and smoothed out the wrinkle I had tried to create. The records were gone. The boy was changed. And now, the evidence was dust. I stood there in the gloaming, the blackness of the Allegheny pressing against my skin, and I felt a heavy, terminal certainty. I wasn't reporting for duty anymore. I was being recruited. The forest didn't want my reports. It didn't want my interference. It wanted my silence. From somewhere deep beneath the stone at my feet, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic thudding. 1, 2, 3. It was the sound of a heart beating in the earth, or maybe just the sound of someone knocking on a door that was no longer there. I looked at Lena, and for a second, her eyes seemed to flicker, a flash of oily black reflected in the light, gone before I could be sure. "Let's go home," she said. But I knew as we walked back through the skeletal trees that I wasn't going home. I was still in the vault. I would always be in the vault. The forest had closed the hatch, and I was on the wrong side of the door. The silence in the cruiser on the way back wasn't just a lack of sound. It was an absence of reality. Lena sat in the passenger seat, her profile a jagged silhouette against the flickering dash lights, her hands trembling so violently she had to tuck them under her thighs. She had seen the vault. She had seen the red-wrapped trophies of the dead. And then, she had seen the forest swallow it whole, replacing a subterranean tomb with a solid slab of prehistoric siltstone as if the earth itself had a delete key. I drove with my jaw locked, my teeth grinding against the metallic taste of adrenaline and old copper. My mind kept looping back to that red string, the way it had been knotted, not with the clumsy fingers of a man, but with the surgical precision of something that understood the anatomy of a tether. I didn't go to the precinct. I didn't go to my apartment. I drove until the asphalt turned to gravel and the gravel turned to the mulched remains of old logging roads. I needed Isaac. Isaac lived in a cabin that looked like it was being slowly digested by the Allegheny. The porch sagged like a broken lip, and the windows were filmed with the grey dust of decades. He was a relic, a man who had worn the Stetson and the badge back when the Kinzua Dam was still a fresh scar on the face of the valley. He didn't act surprised when I kicked his door open. He was sitting in a moth-eaten armchair, the only light in the room coming from a dying fire that cast long, amber-tone shadows across walls covered in hand-drawn maps and yellowing news clippings. The air smelled of wood smoke, wet dog, and something sharper, the ozone scent of a coming storm. "Sit down," Isaac said, his voice a dry rasp like dead leaves on a driveway. He didn't look at me. He looked at the fire. "You saw the spirals. You saw the red twine." I didn't sit. I paced the narrow room, the floorboards screaming under my boots. "They're erasing the files, Isaac. Rimrock, the shoes, the tunnel under the ridge, it's all being bleached out of the system." My sergeant threatened my badge. And Lena. Lena saw the room vanish. She saw the earth heal itself. Isaac finally looked up. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but behind the haze, there was a terrifying clarity. "They aren't erasing it to protect the department, kid. They're erasing it because the forest demands a clean slate. When they built the Kinzua in '65, they didn't just flood the Seneca lands. They drowned the old veins, the deep paths. Those things down there, the ones who slept in the dry dark, they woke up with water in their lungs. They're angry, and they're hungry, and they've been looking for a way out of the silt ever since." I felt a cold prickle of static crawl up my spine. "The tenders," I whispered, remembering the name from the fragmented whispers of the old-timers. Isaac nodded, the amber firelight dancing in his dead eyes. "The tenders of the flooded paths. They aren't monsters, not at first. They're us. Or they were us. Someone has to mark the new vents. Someone has to guide the pressure so it doesn't crack the world open. We leave them tokens. We tie the red string to let them know where the boundaries are. It's a peace treaty written in the blood of the missing. You find a shoe, a watch, a ring, you leave it. You don't report it. You don't dig. Because if you dig, you're volunteering for the job." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The red sneakers. The spiral of stones. The vault of trophies. I hadn't been investigating a crime. I had been interrupting a ritual. The fire popped, a spark landing on the hearth like a dying star. Lena made a small, choked sound from the doorway. I turned, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the shadows in the corner of Isaac's room, shadows that seemed to be stretching, reaching out like oily fingers toward her ankles. "We have to go," I said, grabbing her arm. Her skin was ice cold. We didn't make it to the car. The forest didn't wait for the cover of night. The fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, smelling of stagnant river water and rotting vegetation. It wasn't a weather pattern, it was a wall. Lena stumbled, her foot catching on a root that felt too much like a hand. I reached for her, but the world suddenly went sideways. The ground didn't just give way, it dissolved. I woke up face down in the dirt, the taste of grit and iron in my mouth. The cruiser was gone. Isaac's cabin was gone. There was only the oppressive canopy of the Allegheny and a silence so heavy it made my ears ring with phantom static. "Lena," I croaked. No answer. Only the sound of water. A rhythmic, heavy dripping, like a leak in a giant, rusted pipe. I followed the sound. My flashlight beam was weak, the batteries dying as if the dark was draining their life force. I found the culvert near the edge of a forgotten creek bed. It was a massive concrete throat, half choked with debris and stained with the black mold of a century. And there, tied to the rusted iron grating, was a single loop of red string. I crawled inside. The space was tight, the air thick with the smell of wet limestone and something sweet, like wilting lilies in a funeral parlor. I pushed through a foot of freezing, black water until the pipe opened into a vaulted chamber that shouldn't have existed. It was the same architecture as the room under the ridge, the hand-carved stairs, the weeping walls. Lena was there. She was standing in the center of the chamber, her back to me. She was barefoot, her uniform torn and caked with the gray silt of the Kinzua. Around her feet, hundreds of red strings radiated outward like a web, disappearing into the cracks in the floor. "Lena, thank God," I said, reaching for her shoulder. When she turned, I didn't scream. I couldn't. The air had been sucked out of my lungs. Her eyes weren't eyes anymore. They were two pits of polished black stone, wet and reflective, showing me a distorted version of my own terrified face. When she spoke, the voice didn't come from her throat. It came from the walls, a jewel-toned resonance that vibrated in my marrow. "The old one is tired," the voice said. "The one in the cabin. The ink is dry. The knots are fraying. The shadows behind her began to coalesce, taking the shape of something tall, thin, and impossibly pale, its limbs moving with the jagged, clicking precision of an insect. It didn't have a face, just a vertical slit that pulsed with the dull, rhythmic glow of an ember. The paths are rising, the voice echoed. The river wants its due. We need a hand to hold the line. We need a watcher to keep the silence. Lena's hand reached out, her fingers twitching in time with the dripping water. In her palm lay a jagged piece of siltstone, wrapped tightly in a fresh, vibrant strand of red twine. "Give her back," I whispered, my hand moving to my service weapon. But my fingers felt like lead. The holster was empty. A trade, the entity hissed through Lena's lips. A life for a life. A tongue for a tongue. Tie the knot, and the girl walks. Tie the knot, and the forest stays quiet. Refuse, and we let the water rise. We will flood the valleys. We will take the children from their beds and fill their lungs with the mud of the old world. I looked at Lena. A single tear, black as motor oil, rolled down her cheek. She was in there, buried under the weight of the void, screaming in a way I could only feel in the back of my skull. I didn't think about the badge. I didn't think about the law. I thought about the red sneakers neatly placed by the rift. I thought about the boy, Edward, and his stained hands. I thought about the silence that was waiting to swallow us all. I took the stone from her hand. The moment my skin touched the red string, the world exploded into white noise. It felt like 1,000 needles being driven into my wrist. I fell to my knees, the wet stone biting into my skin, and I began to tie. I tied the knots I had seen in the vault. I tied the loops that held the dead in place. I tied my name, my history, and my future into the braid. The pain was visceral, a rotting heat that spread from my arm to my chest. I felt my vision fracturing, the amber firelight of Isaac's cabin merging with the black water of the culvert. Lena gasped, her body jerking as if she'd been hit by a live wire. She slumped forward, vomiting a torrent of thick, black water that smelled of the deep silt. Her eyes cleared, the black stone fading back into the terrified blue of a woman who had just stared into the center of a dead star. "Go," I tried to say, but my voice was a rasp, a dry echo of Isaac's. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She scrambled out of the chamber, her frantic splashing receding into the dark of the pipe. I sat there in the silence, the red string vibrating against my pulse. The entity was gone. The chamber was gone. I woke up at dawn on the floor of the forest, the morning mist clinging to the trees like a shroud. My cruiser was parked 50 yards away, the engine ticking as it cooled. My uniform was clean. My badge was polished. But when I pulled back my sleeve, I saw it. A thin, raised welt of angry red skin circled my right wrist. It wasn't a scar. It was a brand. A permanent loop of red string, etched into my flesh as if it had always been there. I went back to work. I had to. That's part of the deal. Lena quit the force 3 days later. She didn't say goodbye. She moved to Arizona, as far from the water and the trees as a person could get. I hear she doesn't sleep in the dark anymore. I hear she keeps the faucets in her house taped shut. I stay. I patrol the Allegheny. I find the things that people lose, the single glove, the rusted key, the lock of hair. I don't put them in evidence bags. I take them to the rifts. I tie them with the red twine I now keep in my tactical vest, and I leave them for the things below. The department leaves me alone. The sergeant doesn't look me in the eye. They know. They're glad it's me and not them. Last night, I was sitting in my kitchen, the house dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. I was staring at the red mark on my wrist, feeling it throb with a dull, subterranean heat. Then, I heard it. From deep inside the pipes, beneath the porcelain of the sink, there was a sound. A slow, rhythmic knocking. 1, 2, 3. It counted all the way to 9. A steady, wet thud against the metal. The tenders are never off duty. The flooded paths are restless tonight, and I can feel the river, cold and black, rising up to meet me from the drain. The forest isn't just watching me anymore. It's waiting for me to finish the knot. The burn on my wrist isn't a burn. It is a signature written in ice and stagnant water. It pulses with a rhythm that does not match my heart. It is slower, a heavy, dragging beat that feels like stones being rolled over a muddy riverbed. When I look at it in the flickering fluorescent light of my kitchen, the skin doesn't look charred or scarred. It looks translucent. It looks like the surface of a deep pool where something is rising from a silt. I stare at the sink drain. The sound stopped at 9. 9 thuds. 9 reminders of the debt I paid to bring Lena back from the threshold. I remember the way she looked in that concrete throat of the earth, her eyes turned into polished obsidian, reflecting a world that hasn't seen the sun in 10,000 years. She didn't come back whole. She came back empty, a hollowed-out shell that screams when she hears the sound of running water. She left the force, left the state, left everything behind, but I stayed. I had to stay. You don't walk away from a contract written in the marrow of the forest. The Allegheny National Forest is no longer a place of trees and trails to me. It is a lid. It is a thin, crumbling crust of dirt and pine needles stretched over a vast, hungry machine. The Kinzua Dam didn't just drown the valleys and the homesteads. It drowned the entrances. It pressurized the dark. Now, the things that lived in the cool, silent spaces of the earth are compressed, squeezed by millions of tons of water, looking for any hairline fracture to bleed through. I pull a coil of red nylon rope from my kit. It feels heavy, greasy, though there is no oil on it. My fingers move with a mechanical precision I didn't learn at the academy. I know the knots. I didn't study them. They just exist in my hands now, like a recovered memory. A loop, a twist, a tuck. The spiral. The mark of the tender. I walk out onto my porch. The moonlight is a bruised blue, casting long, jagged shadows that seem to detach themselves from the trees. The silence is the worst part. It's not the absence of sound. It's a physical weight. It's the sound of a billion insects holding their breath. It's the sound of the soil waiting to swallow. I drive toward the Rimrock Overlook, the tires of my cruiser crunching on the gravel like bone being ground into flour. I don't turn on my sirens. I don't turn on my high beams. I don't need them. I can see the ley lines now. I can see the places where the air shimmers like heat off a summer road, even in the dead of a mountain winter. These are the pressure valves. These are the places where the drowned ones are pushing. I reach the trailhead and step out. The air smells of ozone and wet wool. My wrist flares with a sudden, sharp cold. I walk toward a specific cluster of hemlocks, a place where the shadows seem to pool like spilled ink. I find the stone. It's a smooth, grey river rock, out of place among the jagged sandstone of the ridge. It was left there for me. Or perhaps it grew there, birthed by the pressure below. I begin the work. I kneel in the dirt, the cold seeping into my joints. I take the red rope and begin to wind it around the stone, chanting the numbers under my breath. 1, 2, 3. The forest seems to lean in closer. I can hear the creak of the branches, but there is no wind. It's the sound of the trees adjusting their grip on the earth, making room for what is coming. Isaac told me once that the tenders were the only thing keeping the forest from screaming. He was a broken man, his skin the color of parchment, but I understand him now. We are the janitors of the abyss. We are the ones who grease the gears of the nightmare so it doesn't have to grind its way into the light. If I don't tie this knot, if I don't leave the offering, the river will rise. Not the river on the map. The other one. The one that flows through the veins of the mountain, thick with the memories of things that died before the first fire was struck. I finish the spiral. I place the stone in the center of a small, hand-cleared patch of earth. As soon as the stone touches the ground, the static in the air vanishes. My ears pop. For a second, I feel a sense of profound, terrifying peace. It's the feeling of a predator that has been fed and has decided, for tonight, to let you live. I walk back to the cruiser, my legs feeling like lead. On the way, I pass the spot where Edward's shoes were found. The shoes are gone, of course, evidence in a file that has been scrubbed, redacted, and buried in a basement in Harrisburg. But the scent remains. The smell of rusted iron and old, still water. It never leaves. It's in my clothes. It's in my skin. It's in the coffee I drink and the air I breathe. I look at the radio. It's dead. No static, no chatter. Just a void. I know that if I were to key the MIC and speak, no one on the other end would hear me. But they would hear. The ones in the flooded paths. They would hear my voice and recognize it as their own. When I get back to my cabin, I don't go to sleep. I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see the maps. Not the topographies of the Forest Service, but the maps of the veins. I see the way the Kinzua Dam sits like a lead weight on a pulsing throat. I see the tunnels, the hand-carved stairs, the rooms filled with the spoils, the watches, the rings, the locks of hair, the small, wet tokens of lives that were traded for silence. I go to the bathroom sink. I wait. I stand there in the dark, the only light coming from the moon bleeding through the frosted window. 1. A wet, heavy thud from deep within the plumbing. It's not a mechanical sound. It's the sound of a palm hitting metal. 2. The water in the trap of the drain ripples, though the faucet hasn't been turned on in hours. 3. I feel the mark on my wrist begin to glow with a dull, subterranean light. The red line of the rope burn looks like a living thing, a worm beneath my skin. 4. The walls of the cabin seem to pulse. The wood is groaning, not from the cold, but from the weight of the attention being focused on this room. 5. I see a dark fluid begin to bead around the edges of the drain. It's not oil. It's not blood. It's the essence of the mountain, a concentrated void that defies the light. 6. The count is getting louder. The thuds are shaking the floorboards now. I can feel the vibration in my teeth. 7. I remember Lena's face as I pulled her out. The way she didn't look at me. The way she looked through me, at the thing that was standing behind me in the dark. I realize now she wasn't looking at a monster. She was looking at my future. 8. The air in the bathroom is freezing. My breath hangs in a thick, grey cloud. The smell is overpowering now. Rotting vegetation, wet earth, and something metallic, like a mouthful of copper pennies. 9. Silence. The tapping stops. The debt is acknowledged. The watch is set. I reach out and touch the faucet. The metal is so cold it sticks to my skin. I turn the handle, and for a split second, the water that comes out is black. Pitch black. It swirls into the drain like a closing eye. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it clears. It's just water again. Clear, cold, mountain water. But I know better. I walk to the mirror and wipe away the frost. My reflection looks older. My eyes have a frantic, hollowed-out quality, but there's something else there, too. A shadow behind the iris. A hint of the obsidian that took Lena. I am the state trooper of the Allegheny. I wear the badge. I wear the uniform. I patrol the roads and I check the campers. I tell the tourists to be careful of the bears and the steep drop-offs. I act like a man of the law, a man of the world that makes sense. But when the sun goes down and the blue light of the moon begins to carve out the shapes of the trees, I am something else. I am the one who ties the knots. I am the one who listens to the pipes. I am the gatekeeper of the drowned. The forest isn't watching me. It's using me. I am a part of its digestive system now, a white blood cell trying to keep the infection of the light from reaching the deep, dark places that need to stay hidden. I hear a branch snap outside. It's heavy. Something with weight. Something that doesn't care about being quiet. I don't reach for my service weapon. It's useless against what's out there. Instead, I reach for my pocket, feeling the rough texture of the red twine and the smooth, cold surface of a stone I picked up earlier. The tapping starts again. But this time, it's not coming from the sink. It's coming from the front door. 1. Slow. Deliberate. Wet. I walk toward the door. I don't ask who it is. I don't look through the peephole. I know what's on the other side. It's time to go back into the trees. It's time to find the next crevice. It's time to pay the rent for the air we breathe. The mark on my wrist is burning. The river is rising. And the knot is never truly finished.